Korea was never meant to be split. Unification was always the main goal, but as time went along, the idea that the two could reunite seems to have come and went. When you look at it, the division of Korea is now the last remnant of the Cold War. Germany and Vietnam were just like Korea, divided, but while those eventually came together, Korea didn't. Now things are so far different decades later, Korea is so culturally split. Reunification is a laughable joke. But what if it wasn't like this? What if today Korea was unified? This whole decades-long split between the two never happened. Back in the 1950s, one side was victorious in the Civil War and united the country under its own government. There were times in the war that both sides could have won, so that's why I'm dividing this video into two alternate scenarios. One, if South Korea won the war, and the other, if North Korea won the war. So what possibly might have occurred? If you don't really know that much about the Korean War, then I recommend watching this video to catch you up. Okay? Good. First, what if South Korea had won the war? In this alternate timeline, it's the 1950s. The United States and the UN easily pushed back the North Koreans, beating the communists back to the 38th parallel. Wanting to stop any future conflict from occurring, the decision is made to eliminate North Korea as a threat. The coalition invades the North, obliterates what little defenses they have left, captures Pyongyang, and chases the communist forces all the way up to the Chinese border. Now, the only reason why North Korea exists today is because of China. In our timeline, they were threatened by so many American troops on their border that they decided to attack. The Chinese sent thousands of troops into Korea, pushing the coalition south and keeping the North alive. In this alternate timeline, for some reason, China simply doesn't fight in the war. This is, of course, extremely unlikely, but that's the only way for the Americans to fully defeat North Korea, if China simply doesn't become involved. By 1951, the remainder of communist forces surrender to the UN coalition. North Korea is officially dissolved. There is no more North or South. It's all under the former Southern government, now the United Korean government. Glorious leader Kim Il-sung is either captured, executed, or goes into hiding. This goes for all communists and sympathizers. Many either flee into China or go underground. The United Government begins a nationwide purge against suspected communists all across the country. Hundreds of thousands, even millions of suspected communists are executed. Secret mass graves covered up by the government. If this seems a bit excessive, well, that's exactly what happened in our timeline as well. At least 100,000 suspected communist citizens were killed in the summer of 1950 alone by the South Korean regime. So in this scenario, it's not shocking that once the North surrenders, a large violent purge begins to remove all of Kim Il-sung's influence. For most, reunification isn't hard at all. It's only been 5 years of separation. The division was bloody, but it would only be seen as a civil war. The war was short, but it devastated the country's infrastructure. This new united Korea is too weak to deal with this themselves, so for a while, they're reliant on aid from the Americans to fuel the weak nation's economy. For a while, it's not sunshine and rainbows. It's not a place where democracy reigns. It would be similar to what the South was for much of its history, authoritarian and unstable. In our timeline, the South suffered regime change after regime change, and this wouldn't be different simply because the country united. This leaves Korea's fate very unpredictable, and down two very different paths. 1. Korea remains a pretty impoverished state due to lacking leadership. Its economy just never prospers. 2. Korea is basically the same as today, but instead it's all over Korea and not just the South. This alternate Korean War changes the perception that the Americans have on the fight against communism. On the global stage, this was a slap to the face of the Soviets. A show of force that the Americans would contain communism. Almost a textbook example of what could go right, like a 1950s Persian Gulf War. Korea is less of a major, brutal war and simply a military action, but it's used as an example of Western power over the Soviet bloc. Korea isn't the forgotten war. It's a nice little war. so most people pretty much forget about the region as a whole, and foreign aid is simply to help the Koreans rebuild. For China, Korea is now an enemy at its doorstep. The decision to not attack was a horrible one, and it hurt their already weakening relationship with the Soviets. They'd be pretty bitter. The US military understands this and keeps troops in Korea to ward off any Chinese threat. Switching things around now to the other alternate timeline, what if North Korea instead had won the war? The initial invasion plays out just like our own. The North Koreans invade the South, not expecting the United States to retaliate or even care about Korea in general. Kim Il-sung believes that the Americans have other matters, and Korea would mean very little. Of course, though, he was dead wrong. But in this alternate timeline, he's actually right. The United States cares very little about the invasion and doesn't attack. This is practically impossible to happen considering the Cold War and all, but this is really the only possible way North Korea could have won. It's not like they'd win from superior firepower against the Americans. See a pattern here? Without American and UN commitment, the South Koreans are overrun. The Southern government and military is soon entirely defeated. The whole country falls to Kim Il-sung. So, what now? The international community can't put sanctions on it, considering China and Russia are both allies who would just ignore the UN and give Korea any supplies it needs. So does Kim Il-sung make a glorious Korean regime to take over all of East Asia, then eventually the world? Well, no. Most of the consequences occur outside Korea, more specifically, the United States. Since the United States does nothing to stop the communists from taking over another country, this is a major embarrassment for President Truman and the US. Keep in mind at the time, China had just fallen to communism, which was also blamed on Truman as well. So another incident like that leaves the United States even more shaken. America was meant to at least contain the spread of communism, and even if South Korea wasn't extremely important, it was still under American control, and its loss is a symbolic threat to the global fight against communists. The fall of Korea would not be forgotten. Oh no, it'd be a fire which would kickstart a whole new Red Scare. Americans and democracy as a whole is seen as on the defensive, communist forces literally invading and conquering nations. The thing about fear is, it turns into policy. Korea's loss changes the way the United States conducts itself in the 1950s. It would not want to lose the next conflict. It would be less likely to give any communist state a single inch. I think you know where I'm going with this. Vietnam. We think of Vietnam as a 1960s war, but the US was deeply involved in it ever since the 50s. The US helped aid the French to a limited degree, but they soon lost to the Viet Minh, and the country was divided into North and South. In our timeline, America didn't fully commit to the French because of the stalemate that was the Korean War. Eisenhower had very conflicted feelings. He wanted to help the French win the war, and the US could have. He didn't want another communist state in Asia, but he worried it'd devolve into another Korea. With the loss of Korea, however, there is no stalemate, but there is an urge for revenge. In this alternate timeline, the US can't afford to be embarrassed again. There is high public support for a conflict against the communist Vietnamese far before there is ever a North Vietnam. By the early 1950s, the Americans come to the French aid, sending in ground troops and bombers. Imagine the Vietnam War of our timeline, but far sooner. This conflict is not limited. One major reason the United States couldn't conclude the Vietnam War was because it couldn't simply invade the North with ground forces. That'd start World War III. But since this conflict takes place while Vietnam is a French colony, the Americans can simply roll in. The United States doesn't need to worry about invading a sovereign communist North. That means in this alternate timeline, the United States and French crushed the nationalist/communist rebellion. Ho Chi Minh is captured or killed as the United States invades the North. By the 1960s, the counterculture movement is certainly not as prevalent without Vietnam, and in fact, the entire decade is much more like the 50s. The loss of a tiny country changes the course of America. I'll let you imagine the ramifications of that. Meanwhile, Korea is a communist state under Kim Il-sung. They have an extensive cult of personality much like Stalin, and mass purges occur against capitalist Koreans. But for the most part, Korea remains relatively quiet as it's under Chinese and Soviet control. Its history is much of the same up until the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapses. Without a war with the Americans, Korea doesn't have an enemy to latch onto, and since South Korea had already fallen by the 1950s, the United States just considered it a lost cause. Perhaps by the fall of the Soviet Union, Korea is moderate enough to begin a relationship with the Americans. There isn't as much of a cult of personality, and instead the country becomes less communist, just like China and Vietnam in our timeline. Comparing both scenarios, there is one thing that stands out. Whoever wins, North or South, allows their dominant country, either the Soviets or Americans, to have a significant advantage in the Cold War. A decisive victory would have been a fantastic political moment for either side, but since it was just a stalemate, it became an awkward pause that, to this day, still hasn't been resolved. This, however, is simply a couple of scenarios. We'll never truly know what would have happened, but it's always fun to theorize. What do you think would have happened? This is Cody of the Alternate History Hub. This video was brought to you by Squarespace. I'm sure you've heard that name before, but for good reason. Squarespace is a fantastic service that allows you to create your own website. By using Squarespace, you're given the tools to easily build your own online presence. In fact, you can get these tools right now and save 10% by signing up using the special link in the description, squarespace.com/althistory. Creators always have to deal with the hassle of technology, but Squarespace is cross-platform, no plugins, and never updates. It simply provides you with an easy way to build your own professional-looking site without worry. If you have any questions, it can help you along the way with 24/7 customer service. It's the next step taken while cutting the stress of expanding your brand. For me, I used it to create my own domain and personal site for the channel, a site that I link for my social media accounts and say what the channel is about. Of course, there is still a lot of work to be done, but by using Squarespace, it made my process of creating a site far faster and with less of a hassle. Just start by saving 10% at squarespace.com/althistory. The link is in the description for you to start your own site. This is Cody of the Alternate History Hub.